Will you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I don't know about you all, but one of the things I'm missing most in this COVID Advent is the chance to sing and belt out hymns with all of you here. There, I said it. Yes, it does help to be here, but it's not the same without all of you filling the space with your bodies and your voices. Though we cannot gather, and even as we long to sing together, at this time of year especially, we can still be grateful for what we do here, for the gifts of Peter's magnificent voluntaries, his live-streamed accompaniment, his preparing with the choir virtual introits and anthems like Vivaldi's Gloria that we just heard. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, choir diaspora. I'm also grateful for our Advent song that we've been singing for 3 weeks now. Give us light in the darkness to sing our souls awake. It's been popping into my mind in the kitchen and in the shower, and has definitely been helping me to carry me through these weeks. I hope and pray you all are finding ways to keep the gifts of music alive in your homes and households this season. If not, it's not too late. Today we turn our attention to one of the most powerful songs of all time, the song or the Canticle of Mary, also known as the Magnificat. We often enjoy it as a hymn or an anthem, but today I wonder if we might hear it a little bit differently. First, as a product of its own culture, and then as a decidedly countercultural musical manifesto. Our Janet McKenzie banners have helpfully reminded us again that the historical Mary was a young woman of color, a first-century Palestinian Jew from a podunk town. But what else can we know about the real Mary? And how did she come to sing this glorious song? For one thing, her name in Hebrew was Miriam. That's what her parents would have called her. Miriam is often translated as beloved or exalted. But one translation of Miriam is rebellious. Sounds like a good fit for a teenager, right? And this leads me to wonder, what did Mary do for fun? What did she listen to? Can we imagine her doing that first century equivalent of thumbing through her parents' records and pulling out the gems that spoke to her heart? What, after all, were her early influences before that amazing Magnificat debut? The Magnificat itself offers some helpful clues. In fact, it holds echoes of Hebrew scriptures that Mary must have heard as a kid and that would have shaped her. Scholars have found in the Magnificat connections to Psalm 113, for example, to the biblical songs of Deborah and of Judith. But most agree that the Magnificat's greatest influence is from a deep track found in the 1 Samuel chapter 2, recorded centuries before. It's called the Song of Hannah. Hannah was once an infertile mother of Hannah was the once infertile mother of the great prophet Samuel. And here's her song. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in you, O Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. You bring low, you also exalt. You raise up the poor from the dust. You lift the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are yours. corners, and on them you have set the world. I hope this sounds familiar. It seems like it could have been on Mary's pre-Magnificat playlist. But both Mary and Hannah's songs emphasize themes of exaltation in God's strength and greatness. They stress God's justice for the poor and the downtrodden and a genuine disruption of our all-too-human social order. Let's not be mistaken here. This is radical stuff, especially coming from the lips of girls in a patriarchal culture set in the midst of an oppressive imperial regime. When Mary sings her own first-century version of these ancient texts, she lives up to her name and then some. She's a rebel with a cause. She's a young girl who has found her voice and purpose in life and who is ready to joyously and defiantly sing it out for all the world to hear. Since learning that Mary can mean rebel, I have had this image in my head of Mary as something of a young punk rocker. Maybe a first-century Palestinian Patti Smith, that great 70s singer-songwriter and so-called punk poet laureate. I didn't grow up listening to a lot of punk, but I always loved the spirit that seemed to drive its often aggressive and decidedly countercultural songs and ethos. Yes, we can think of tattoos and piercings and spiked hair. I'd love to see that on one of our banners someday. But more deeply, we can think of the lyrics that were forged in the gritty margins of the 70s and 80s class and gender struggles. Punk was and is a decidedly anti-establishment movement that sought and seeks to overturn religious and political and socioeconomic hierarchies and convention. Punk at its best is about defiance and authenticity and a do-it-yourself mentality that flouts capitalism and consumer culture. As Scott Carter has noted, punk is all about violation of the social order, of the expected order. Indeed, we can see this in the Magnificat's great reversals. The lowly shall be lifted up, the rulers shall be brought down, and the rich sent away. Carter goes on to say, Christianity is a movement about violation of God into the world. God showing up and not looking like anyone expected. A Messiah who didn't fight. A son of David who included the Gentiles. Who verbally attacked religious leaders, who chased bankers, who hung out with outcasts. That's punk. Somewhere along the way, Christianity became what was normal, what was expected, but it wasn't always this way, and Mary reminds us of a new and different future that is anything but normal. Y'all know Patti Smith, by the way? Turns out that 45 years ago today, December 13th, 1975, she released her debut album, Horses, and with it, the breakthrough track that happened to be called, get this, Gloria in Excelsis Deo, like the anthem we just heard. Here's how Rolling Stone magazine described the impact of it after naming it number 26 on their recent list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. From its defiant first line, quote, Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine. The opening shot in a bold reinvention of Van Morrison's 60s garage rock classic, Gloria. Patti Smith's debut album was a declaration of committed mutiny, a statement of faith in the transfigurative powers of rock and roll. Now that opening line, that Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine, was part of why the song and album grew so popular. Much like the Magnificat on the lips of a young girl from Nazareth, it challenged theological orthodoxy. It also channeled Smith's desire to have Christians start taking some DIY responsibility for their sins and actions. Smith later commented that she was merely rebelling against her Jehovah's Witness upbringing, questioning what never really made sense to her, but that she believed in Jesus all along. When she performed the song in 1989, she even changed the lyrics. Jesus died for somebody's sins, why not mine? I wonder if Smith might just consider Mary and the Magnificat as one of her early and lasting influences. Along with moving away from decidedly white images of Mary, maybe we can also set aside the images that Mary was some sort of a buttoned-up, meek and mild choir girl. Humor me if you must, but can we instead, at least for today, imagine Mary in a mosh pit? That is, on a sweaty dance floor, a teen full of vigor, thrashing her head in joyful, defiant praise and driving purpose. Can we at least see Mary as that teenage rebel, enlisting in what Broderick Greer would call an underground scene of Hebrew resistance, envisioning an Israel free of occupation, and ultimately a God who keeps God's promise of liberating God's people? The fact is, Mary's song is no timid solo, but a loud, robust protest song. She, along with Elizabeth, is belting the first note of revolution. I believe that Christianity, at its best, is just such an underground scene of resistance movements, of liberation, of faith-rooted love and prayerful activism that cries out from the margins with those who live at the margins. If nothing else, I hope you can see what I mean by turning up the volume a little bit on the Magnificat this year, with some of its edgier and even grungier notes that we can let ring free. Our world needs her spiritually rooted, defiant message now more than ever. And yet its punk lives on, and with it, a hope for a better future. Just consider young teen women today. Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, Emma Gonzalez of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Just a few days ago, Nadia Tolankonikova, activist, artist, and founder of the feminist punk band and art collective Pussy Riot, penned the following lines for the New York Times. In 2020, we were not only hit by a global pandemic, but also by police batons. We watched as protesters around the world breathed in thick air with tear gas, lost their eyesight from rubber bullets, and endured torture, arrest, and imprisonment for participating in peaceful protests. This was a year of radical political imagination. 2020 invited us to take our dreams seriously and inspired us to envision a better, alternative future. After recounting her arrests and jail time following anti-Kremlin rallies, she speaks powerfully about police reform efforts, celebrates the work of global activists who have achieved so much in recent years, in part by combining the struggles of racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, environmental justice. Have you been wondering what's been good about 2020? Here's what she says. The mass social movements of 2020 taught us to think holistically and intersectionally, to ask big questions and imagine a better future. The virus has sometimes limited our ability to protest in the streets, but we've learned new ways to perform our civic duties and have become more effective digital activists. Our future has yet to be written. When Pussy Riot writes new music, we ask ourselves, what will activist punk sound like in 2030? What will it talk about? They have a new album coming out soon, so we will see. But she concludes by saying that sustained, organized, creative, peaceful, and smart activism will bring us closer to realizing a fully democratic world in 2021 and in the years to come. Maybe isn't quite a Magnificat of our time, but I love her defiant hopefulness. If we look carefully, we might be able to trace the thread of powerful, countercultural, anti-establishment words and songs being sung by badass, persistent young women from Hannah to Mary to punk rock legends like Patti Smith and Pussy Riot. What's more, we might be inspired to create our own spiritual and values-rooted activist sound, whether it be classical or punk or folk or funk. Before I close, I'd like to share just the beginning of a poem by Wisława Szymborska. It's titled Classifieds. Whoever's found out what location compassion, parenthetically heart's imagination, can be contacted at these days, is herewith urged to name the place and sing about it in full voice and dance like crazy and rejoice beneath the frail birch that appears to be upon the verge of tears. Friends, Advent orients us to the location of compassion, and with it, to the space where God's justice and love are made real. It is born through Mary. It is born in Jesus, and we are urged to align our hearts with our spiritual ancestors in singing it out and letting it be born again, whether in classical music or carols or hymns or through protest songs, punk anthems, or slam poetry. That's where justice and joy meet. When we can contact the very ground of our compassion in God and Christ and align ourselves, our every word, song, and movement with our deepest values, acting out of conviction and authenticity and deep purpose. We can name the place. It's wherever we find Jesus, in poor and lowly places, in the streets, in cries for justice, in the aching of our hearts, in songs of sorrow and joy. And so we are urged to sing about it in full voice and dance like crazy and rejoice, even amidst a frail earth that is weeping, even when we can't gather to sing together. We'll sing a hymn together soon, but I have some homework for you all after this service. By invitation of Mary's Magnificat, do yourselves a favor sometime today or this week and find a favorite song, whether online or by thumbing through some old vinyl. Maybe it's a carol, maybe it's Bach, maybe it's Aretha or reggae or hardcore heavy metal. Maybe it's Patti Smith's Gloria, Gloria. Just make sure it has some rebellious kick to it. And whatever it is, listen to it. And locate yourselves in God's revolutionary love. Don't worry about doing it alone. It might even be better if you do. Crank up the volume, and if you can sing with it, go ahead and belt it out. In so doing, let your hearts too magnify God's name. Let your spirit rejoice, for our God has done and is doing great things. With Mary, may all of our hearts sing out in joyful and defiant praise. Amen.